The Old Testament has many rules and laws. How do we know which ones to still take literally and which ones are figurative and no longer apply?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's 613, according to an Orthodox rabbi that I've spoken with, 613 laws, particular laws that they have to abide by. And it's pretty hard for them to abide by it in the modern world because some of them are unusual. But here's the thing. When Jesus comes, I mean, those laws are all predicated on the covenant that God is making with Israel. And it was a plan that he had to raise up this nation to reach the whole earth, and that we could go into what that whole plan was about. But it all was about a nation, and God using that nation to accomplish certain things in this world. And all those laws are particular to those, to God's agenda for that nation. The reason why a lot of those laws really strike us as bizarre and sometimes barbaric is because the reason they're there is for that nation to interact with and stay away from certain aspects of the culture. Some of the laws are barbaric, but they're an improvement over what the surrounding nations have. Other laws are there to keep them from being like the other nations. There's all these things, and until you understand what the other nations were doing, it's really hard to understand why these laws are there. I mean, for crying out loud, don't wear wool and cotton together. What's that about? And here's the kind of pots you can use when you boil goat, and don't ever mix it with. And there's reasons we can find out, at least in a lot of those cases, as to why God maybe would command those things, especially some of the dietary stuff. But the important point is that they're all predicated on the particularity of Israel. When Jesus comes, there's a completely new covenant. Now, it's completely new in one sense, in that it's new, but there is continuity. The main continuity is just the storyline of what God's doing in the world that leads up to the Messiah. And so that's why the Old Testament's important as the background to Jesus. But there's also some continuity in that some of the instructions given to how Jesus' followers are to live are completions of teachings that were given in the Old Testament about how to live. And so the rule of thumb that I give people is this. If it's repeated in the New Testament, well, then it's a part of the Old Testament that we're to still abide by. But we don't abide by it because it's in the Old Testament. We abide by it because it's in the New Testament. And if it's not in the New Testament, then I have no reasons to think that it's something I'm still supposed to abide by. If I was Jewish, maybe, because a lot of it's just cultural things. But I'm not Jewish, and so none of those particulars do I feel compelled to go by, unless it's repeated in the New Testament. You find this whole thing fleshed out in Acts 15, where they had to decide how Gentiles were going to live. I mean, the Gentiles had a lifestyle that was very offensive to the Jews for cultural reasons more than anything else. The Jews went by the 613 commands. The Gentiles went by none. So they got together and said, now that they're followers of Jesus, what are we going to ask them? How are they supposed to live? Do they have to get circumcised? Do they have to obey the law? Whatever. And that was a big issue in the early church. Paul addresses it. The whole book of Galatians is about that. And the answer they came up with was, no, they're not under the law, which is effectively saying the law is a cultural thing. They're under the command of Jesus, and for cultural reasons, for us to get along, here are the things we want you to do. But out of the 613 commands in the Old Testament, they gave them 4. Okay, just do these 4 things. Paul says in Colossians 2 that all the Old Testament teachings and laws were a shadow of things to come. But now that the reality is here, the shadow can be done away with. And that it was abolished on Calvary. And that's why he says, don't let anyone judge you about dietary issues, about what you eat or don't eat, or what you drink or don't drink, or what Sabbath day you're going to have or not going to have, or what holidays you're going to keep. All of that is rendered non-essential. You can do it, you don't have to do it, whatever. But none of it is a law for contemporary Christians.